I've always been someone who loved hiking. The feeling of fresh air, the rustle of leaves beneath my boots, the quiet, peaceful isolation of the wilderness. It's always been my escape, a way to disconnect from the noise of the world. On that particular Saturday morning, I decided to try something different. There was a trail I had seen marked on the map, one that was less traveled, hidden somewhere deep in the mountains that surrounded my town. The kind of trail that you only hear about through word of mouth, or from a stranger who spent years exploring every nook of the forest. It wasn't particularly well known, so it wasn't on any tourist websites. The map simply labeled it as Unmarked Trail. First, the weather was perfect. A little chilly at dawn, but it wasn't unbearable. I packed my backpack carefully, enough water for the trip, some trail mix, a map, and a basic first aid kit. As I passed the last few houses in the small town, the familiar sounds of traffic and everyday life slowly faded away. In the distance, I could already see the edge of the forest line, where the trailhead supposedly began. The road I had been following narrowed, eventually transforming into a rough, dirt path. I pulled my jacket tighter as a gust of wind swept through the trees. The branches above me creaked in the breeze, and I was reminded of the stark beauty of the wilderness. It felt like the kind of hike that would be memorable for its quiet serenity, where the only thing I'd need to worry about was keeping a steady pace. The trail started easy enough, wide, well-worn, and clearly marked. I passed a few other hikers in the first half hour, mostly people out for a quick weekend walk. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization began to disappear entirely. The chirp of birds became more pronounced, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush added a layer of life to the environment. But then, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a general unease that crept over me. The trail began to narrow, and the trees around me grew denser. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, even though the sun was still high. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, I was deep in the wilderness. Sometimes things just feel different when you're out of your element. I checked the map again to reassure myself. The trail was supposed to loop around a small hill, where I'd find an old cabin. According to the few locals I had spoken to, the cabin was abandoned. It seemed like a peaceful, isolated place. Nothing special, but enough to pique my curiosity. The path led me upward, and the incline became steeper. The ground beneath my feet shifted from dirt to loose gravel and jagged rocks, and soon I found myself concentrating on every step to avoid slipping. The trees were thicker now, the trunks larger and gnarled. It wasn't exactly a difficult climb, but it was definitely a slower one. I had been hiking for nearly 2 hours when I realized I had not seen another soul for quite some time. My initial excitement about the solitude began to feel unsettling. The wind had picked up, sending a chill through the air. I looked around. The trail was getting narrower, and the overgrown brush on both sides of me was growing thicker. My instincts told me I should turn back. This was the point where the trail became less traveled, but something kept me moving forward. Curiosity, maybe, or perhaps a sense of determination. Either way, I ignored the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. After another 20 minutes of careful footing, I finally came to the crest of the hill. From there, I had a clear view of the area below. A dense forest that stretched on for miles, with a few rocky outcrops here and there. In the distance, I saw a small structure, the cabin. It was barely visible from this height, half obscured by trees and vegetation, but it was unmistakable. A small, rustic cabin. It looked more like a shed than a house, built with worn, aged wood. Even from this distance, I could tell the place had been abandoned for years. I felt an odd sense of relief wash over me. I had made it. But then, something else caught my eye. A movement in the trees near the cabin. It was quick, too quick to really make out, but I could have sworn I saw something dart between the trunks. I paused. I didn't know what it was, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. It wasn't like there were any other hikers around. I hadn't passed anyone in over an hour, and yet that movement, it didn't feel natural. Shaking off the thought, I pressed on. The path leading down to the cabin was even steeper. The descent was tricky, and I had to move slowly to avoid tumbling. My breath began to quicken, not because of the climb, but because I started to notice small signs of life. Not animals, just little things, like the rustling of leaves without a breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig breaking underfoot. Every so often, I would hear what sounded like someone moving nearby, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. I reached the base of the hill and made my way through the thick underbrush, pushing past some large ferns and low-hanging branches. The cabin was now just a short walk away, and I could clearly see the dirt path that led up to the rickety steps. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the small window next to it was cracked and dirty. I stepped closer, drawn by the curiosity I had ignored for so long. As I reached for the door, I noticed a faint odor, damp and musty, like old wood left to rot in the open air. The place had been untouched for a long time. I didn't expect to find anything of value, just a few remnants of someone's forgotten life. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The interior was dim, the light from the outside barely making it through the dirty windows. Dust covered every surface. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped in, my boots sinking slightly into the rotting floorboards. The air smelled like decay, a sharp, unpleasant scent that stung the back of my throat. I took a few more steps inside, the silence pressing in on me. It was too quiet. There was no sign of any recent visitors, no fresh tracks, no disturbed dust. But that feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My skin prickled as I slowly turned in a circle, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I went back outside and stood at the edge of the porch, my heart racing. That strange feeling was back, an overwhelming sense of discomfort. I glanced at the trees again, that same quick movement. Something or someone was out there. I didn't know if it was human or animal, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started to back away from the cabin, my eyes scanning the trees. Suddenly, I heard it, footsteps behind me, just off to the side. Quick, light, as if someone was moving through the forest just out of sight. I spun around, but there was nothing. The forest was still. The adrenaline kicked in. I turned and ran, not looking back. I didn't care what it was. I had to get out of there. My breath came in short gasps as I sprinted up the steep trail, my feet stumbling over rocks and uneven ground. I didn't stop until I had reached the top of the hill again, gasping for air. I looked around, my eyes wild. Nothing followed me. The forest was silent once again, but the fear still gripped me. It wasn't until I reached the main trail, the one I'd initially hiked up, that I allowed myself to slow down. I looked back one last time, but the forest remained still. The hike back was uneventful. The tension slowly eased as I made my way down the mountain, and by the time I reached the car, I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. What had I experienced up there? Who or what was moving through those trees? I never found out, but I've never hiked that trail again, and I've never been back to that cabin. Sometimes, when I pass that part of the forest, I can't help but glance over, wondering if whatever it was is still watching from the shadows. I never thought a hike in the woods would turn into something I'd never forget. I've hiked plenty of trails over the years, nothing extreme, mostly just short to moderate day trips through woods, along streams, or up small hills. I've always loved nature. The quiet, the smells of pine and wet earth, the fresh air, and the occasional sight of a deer or squirrel darting between the trees. It's peaceful. But that particular day, I wasn't expecting peace. Started out like any other hike. I woke up early, packed my gear the night before, and left my apartment in the city before sunrise. I'd chosen a trail a bit off the beaten path, not too far from where I lived, just far enough to get away from the constant noise and crowds of the city. The trail wasn't particularly popular. It had a reputation for being a little harder to navigate. Mostly locals or people looking for a challenge knew about it. That was what I liked. A chance to escape and have a little solitude. The morning was crisp, the sun just beginning to rise as I set foot on the trail. It was cool enough for a light jacket, but I could already tell it was going to warm up quickly once the sun fully crested over the trees. The path was dirt, narrow, and winding, overgrown in parts where people didn't frequent often. Still, it was nothing that looked intimidating, just nature being itself. The further I walked, the more I was reminded of how beautiful this area was. The trail twisted and turned, leading me through thick underbrush, the sounds of birds chirping high above, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. About 2 hours in, I began to notice the trail became less defined. The dirt path was overgrown in parts, and the usual markings, small signs or painted blazes on trees, became increasingly rare. I didn't think much of it at first. I had a map on my phone and a compass, so I figured I could always find my way back. Still, the further I went, the more I felt like the forest was getting quieter. The birds weren't chirping as much. The wind, which had been blowing lightly through the trees earlier, seemed to have died down completely. The only sound left was the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. It wasn't long before I noticed something else. The path started to split. I hadn't seen any forks in the trail on the map, and the more I looked around, the more I realized the place looked unfamiliar. I hesitated for a moment. I come this far, and I didn't want to turn back just yet. I had a good sense of direction and thought that if I kept following the path, I'd eventually hit something familiar. I took the left fork. At first, it didn't feel too different from the previous part of the trail, but after a while, I began to notice how dense the trees were. The canopy above me was so thick, the sunlight barely reached the ground. It felt darker, colder, despite the sun being out. I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake, but I pushed those thoughts away. I figured it was just a remote part of the forest, and there was nothing to worry about. After another 30 minutes, I stopped to take a quick break. I took a swig of water and surveyed the surroundings. The forest felt almost unnaturally still now. No birds, no wind, no rustling of the leaves. Just silence, the kind that almost feels heavy. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the stillness of nature. I looked at my phone, checking the map again, and realized I was off the trail now. I didn't recognize the area anymore. The trees were different, the ground more uneven. I thought about turning around then, but I didn't want to go back just yet. I kept walking, hoping I'd find a clearing or a sign soon. But the further I went, the more the path seemed to disappear. It wasn't a gradual fade, either. One minute I was walking along a dirt trail, the next minute I was scrambling over rocks, dodging thick brambles and weaving through trees. I'd somehow lost any sense of direction. I checked my phone again. No signal. The battery was also low, which I hadn't anticipated. My gut started to churn, a sense of unease creeping up on me. I tried to dismiss it. After all, I wasn't lost. I knew the general direction back, and I wasn't too far from where I started. But something about the stillness around me made my skin crawl. It wasn't right. I kept walking, trying to stay calm. The silence felt almost unnatural now. I stopped to listen for any sign of life. An animal, the sound of water, anything. But there was nothing. The wind wasn't moving, the air was still, and it was almost too quiet. Then I heard it. A soft sound in the distance, a rustle of leaves that wasn't coming from the wind. I froze. For a split second, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, but it was gone before I could be sure. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here, but I had to keep moving. As I continued, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The silence was suffocating. I found myself looking over my shoulder every few steps, convinced that something was behind me. The trees seemed to be closing in on me, their shadows growing longer as the day wore on. The deeper I went, the less I felt like I was hiking in a peaceful forest, and the more I felt like I was wandering into something wrong. The trail finally ended at a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. Something I should have recognized from the start but had been too distracted to notice. It was a dilapidated cabin. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, and the roof sagged in several places. It looked ancient, forgotten. I'd read about abandoned cabins on hiking forums before, and the thought of exploring one didn't sit right with me. But curiosity gnawed at me. The cabin could be a good landmark to orient myself. I approached cautiously, my feet crunching on the dry leaves underfoot. There was a faint smell of decay in the air, Not the usual earthy scent of a forest, but something darker. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped closer to the cabin, half expecting the door to creak open at any moment, but it remained shut. The place had the kind of eerie stillness that made everything feel wrong. I circled the cabin, looking for any sign of recent activity, but there was nothing. The only thing I found was a half-buried stone marker near the front door. It looked out of place, almost like it had been placed there intentionally. I didn't touch it, but I felt an odd sense of dread come over me as I stared at it. It was then that I heard the rustling again. Louder this time. It was closer. I spun around, but there was no one in sight. I was alone. I felt my heart race, and the hairs on my arms stood up. Something wasn't right. I needed to get out of there. I turned and headed back the way I'd come, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to close in around me. The once familiar trees now looked like they were hiding something in their shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart skip a beat. The deeper I walked, the harder it became to find the trail. Time passed strangely out there. My watch had stopped working, and my phone had completely died. I couldn't tell how long I'd been walking in circles. Every direction seemed to lead me deeper into the woods, and the path became harder and harder to distinguish. I couldn't even tell which way the sun was anymore. It was as if the forest had swallowed me whole. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small stream, and for the first time since I'd gotten lost, I felt a sense of relief. The sound of water was soothing, and I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead me to a road or back to civilization. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a clearing. I was back on a marked trail. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I made my way out of the woods, retracing my steps the whole way. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was setting, and I realized just how close I had come to something bad happening. I didn't understand what had happened out there, why the forest felt so strange, why everything had turned so quiet and disorienting. But I was out, safe, and that was all that mattered. As I drove home, I kept thinking about that cabin, the marker by the door, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the thought that I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to. Maybe I'll never understand what happened, but one thing's for sure, I won't be hiking that trail again. I had been hiking for hours, or at least it felt that way. The trail was winding, narrow, and steep, barely more than a path carved into the side of the mountain. I could feel the weight of the backpack on my shoulders, the straps digging into my skin as I trudged on, my legs sore from the constant climb. The air was thin up here, and each breath felt like a struggle. But it was the solitude that I really felt. At first it was peaceful, but now it was beginning to feel suffocating. I had decided to go alone. It was supposed to be an escape, a way to clear my head and get away from everything. Life had been overwhelming lately, work, relationships, and just the noise of the world in general. I figured a weekend hike would help me reset. I didn't think too much about the trail or the warnings I had read online. Experienced hikers only, the signs had said.
Rugged terrain.
It didn't sound too bad to me. After all, I'd hiked before, right? That was a mistake. I should have paid more attention. The trail was more treacherous than I'd anticipated, especially alone. The forest around me was dense, the trees stretching upward, their branches intertwining to block out much of the sky. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The birds had gone quiet, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I was getting close to the point I had marked on my map, the spot where I planned to camp for the night. My goal was to get to the clearing by dusk, but I had misjudged the time it would take. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the path. I knew I wouldn't make it to the clearing in time, so I started looking for a place to set up camp along the trail. There was nothing, just trees, rocks, and thick underbrush. I found a small patch of flat ground next to a large boulder, sheltered by a ring of trees. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I dropped my pack with a sigh of relief, stretching my aching back. The air had gotten colder, and the sky had turned a dull shade of orange, the last remnants of daylight fading quickly. Setting up my tent was a struggle. The ground was uneven, and I had trouble finding the right spot to secure the stakes. The wind had picked up, causing the tent fabric to flap, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The dark was coming fast, and I was aware that I would be alone here in the forest for the night. I finally got everything in place, a small campfire crackling in front of me. The light from the fire was weak, barely enough to push back the darkness. I sat there, staring into the flames, the only sound the occasional snap of burning wood. As the evening wore on, I felt my unease grow. The quiet had deepened, almost like the forest had gone still on purpose, as if it was holding its breath. The silence was unnerving. I couldn't hear any animals, no insects, no distant sounds of birds settling for the night. I tried to convince myself it was just the time of year, maybe a shift in the weather, or perhaps I had gotten too used to the constant hum of life back home. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I decided to distract myself. I unpacked a small stove and boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal, though my appetite was barely there. The smell of the food did little to comfort me. I ate in silence, my mind wandering, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As night fully fell, the darkness pressed in around me. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that made my skin crawl. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows on the trees. I lay down in my tent, trying to ignore the strange feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and stared up at the top of the tent. The silence outside was heavy, thick enough to suffocate me if I wasn't careful. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, but not without difficulty. Every crackling twig or rustle in the trees made me stir, my heart racing. I had camped in the woods before, but this place felt different. It was as though the forest itself was watching me. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure what had woken me, just a feeling, something that had jolted me awake from a deep sleep. My breath came fast, and my heart pounded in my chest. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear anything. The silence was absolute, but there was a feeling, a sensation in the air, like I wasn't alone anymore. I told myself it was just nerves. It was just the isolation. Maybe it was the way the wind had started up again, or the way the shadows moved around the trees. I lay there for what felt like hours, my eyes wide open, unable to shake the sense of discomfort creeping along my spine. The temperature had dropped again, and I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. Then it happened. A sound. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but I heard it. The faintest crunch of leaves, just outside the tent. I froze, my body stiff with fear. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other small creature. But there was something about the way the sound had come and gone so quickly that made my skin crawl. I waited for a few minutes, not daring to move, and then I heard it again. This time, closer. The crunch of dry leaves beneath something heavy, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening hard. The sound stopped again, and the silence returned, even thicker than before. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but my heart was racing in my chest. It was like the forest had shifted, like something had entered the clearing. I sat up slowly, trying to make no sound. My hands were shaking as I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling with the button. I held it close to my chest, unsure of whether to turn it on. If it was an animal, it might run away, but if it was something else, something I didn't want to confront in the dead of night. The sound came again, but this time it wasn't a crunch. It was a dragging sound, like something scraping against the ground. It was close, too close. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The sound stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was still again. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Not animal, not human, just breathing. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting for something to happen. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, my muscles tense and ready to flee. But nothing happened. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Eventually, the sun started to rise, casting its weak light over the forest, breaking the dark hold that had gripped me. The breathing stopped, and the forest seemed to breathe again, this time with life. I carefully emerged from my tent, scanning the area around me. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It felt like the forest had been holding its breath, watching me, waiting for something. And now that the morning light had returned, it had let go. I gathered my things quickly, packed up my tent, and made my way back to the trailhead as fast as I could, not daring to look behind me. When I finally made it back to my car, I took a deep breath, relieved to be out of the forest. It felt like the weight of the place had lifted, and I could breathe freely again. The hike had ended, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after I was gone. The entire experience left me unsettled. I couldn't explain what had happened out there. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Was it something natural I hadn't noticed before? Or was it something else? Something in the woods that I wasn't meant to understand? I never went back to that place.